name is Tracy Whitfield, and today I will be doing a bracelet tutorial for the Potomac Bead Company. This is my Zolina bracelet design. This design is component based, and we will be making a series of the components, joining them together along with a class to create the bracelet. Now here's the component that we will be making. This component is made up of ZoliDuo beads. We have 2-hole 6mm pyramid beads, 2 by 3mm rondells, and 15-0 seed beads. Now the interesting thing about this component is the pyramid beads. They sit in the center of the component design, but they do not lay flat. They lay at an angle in this design. Okay, so for our project today, we are going to need ZoliDuo beads, and we're going to need both the left and the right, and I will be using the crystal Vitrail color. We're going to need 2-hole 6mm pyramid beads, and these are the 6 by 6mm pyramid beads, and I will be using the crystal Vitrail color. We'll need 2 by 3mm rondells, and I will be using the Potomac crystal rondells in the light sapphire AB color. We'll need 15-0 seed beads. I will be using the crystal Labrador full color. We're going to need a clasp, and for my clasp I'll be using a cup button with a seed bead loop, and the cup button color I have is the crystal Vitrail. For my seed bead loop and also around my cup button, I'll be using 11-0 seed beads, and I'm going to be using the crystal Labrador full in that as well. We'll need 2 size 12 beading needles. Now to make the component itself, we'll only need 1 needle, but when we join the components together to create the bracelet, we'll be using 2 needles. So 2 size 12 beading needles, and we'll also need some beading thread, and I will be using the Wildfire .006 in the Froster white color. Okay, let's get started on this project. Okay, to start off making our component, I have threaded our needle with about 2 feet of beading thread. The pyramid beads are laid out on the mat so that the 2 holes are running horizontally. You have a hole at the top and you'll have a hole at the bottom. To start off, we want to pick up 1 pyramid bead by going through that top hole, followed by 1 15-0 seed bead, and we'll repeat that 3 more times. We'll pick up a pyramid bead by going through the top hole and a 15-0 seed bead, a pyramid bead and a 15-0, a pyramid bead and a 15-0. And we'll let all those beads drop down, and we'll leave about a 3 to 4 inch tail. We want to go through all those beads again to form a circle. And once we have our circle formed, we'll tie 2 knots. Okay, we'll push our tail thread out the way for now. And with our working thread, we want to sew through this next pyramid bead, and then we're going to step up and go through the second hole of the same pyramid bead our thread is now exiting. Now we want to start picking up our ZoliDuo beads. For our ZoliDuo beads, we have this puffier side, and then there's this thinner side. The puffier side has a hole going through it, and that's what I'm calling the top hole. And the thinner side also has a hole, and I will be calling that the bottom hole. So we want to actually pick up our ZoliDuo beads such that they would form a V shape. So we'll be picking up a right ZoliDuo bead by going through this bottom hole, followed by a left ZoliDuo bead going through the bottom hole. So we pick those beads up, and then we sew through the next, or the second hole of the next pyramid bead. We're going to repeat that. We'll pick up our right ZoliDuo through the bottom hole, followed by our left ZoliDuo, and then we'll sew through the second hole of the next pyramid bead. Just get our ZoliDuos and sew through the next hole of the second hole of the next pyramid bead, and we'll pick up our last set of ZoliDuos and go through the next pyramid bead. And this is what you will have. What we want to do now is actually sew through all those beads in that round again to reinforce it. So we'll go through our ZoliDuos and the second hole of the pyramid beads. Okay, once we finish reinforcing that round, our thread will be exiting a pyramid bead. We want to sew through the next ZoliDuo bead, just one ZoliDuo bead. We'll go through the bottom hole of the next ZoliDuo bead. Here we want to pick up 3 15-0 seed beads. And we're going to sew through the top hole of the ZoliDuo bead our thread is now exiting. So we'll step up and go through this top hole, and that will have the 15-0 seed beads sitting along the side of that ZoliDuo. Now we want to pick up a 15-0 seed bead, a 2 by 3 millimeter rondell, and a 15-0, and we're going to sew through. We'll skip over this pyramid bead and sew through the second hole of the next ZoliDuo bead. Here we'll pick up 3 15-0 seed beads, and we're going to sew through the bottom hole of this ZoliDuo bead our thread is now exiting. So we're going to come down and sew through the bottom hole of the ZoliDuo bead, and we'll also be sewing through the next pyramid bead, the pyramid bead that's sitting right next to that ZoliDuo. And this is what you'll have. We'll sew through the bottom hole of the next 2 ZoliDuo beads. Sew through the next pyramid bead. and then we'll sew through the bottom hole of the next ZoliDuo. We're only going to go through one ZoliDuo bead here. And our thread should now be exiting in between these two ZoliDuos. Now, as I'm adding the beads along the edge of this component, I am not, we're not sewing really tight. We don't want our component to buckle up or to warp, so we're not pulling our thread really tight. Here we want to pick up 3 15/0 seed beads, and we're going to step up and come through the second hole of the ZoliDuo bead our thread is now exiting. Here we'll pick up a 15/0, a 2x3mm rondell, and a 15/0 seed bead. And we're going to skip over this pyramid bead and sew through the second hole of this next ZoliDuo. Now here we already have a set of 15/0 seed beads sitting in between these two ZoliDuo beads. So we'll pick up 2 15/0 seed beads, and we're going to sew back down through the last 15/0 that's sitting in between these two ZoliDuos. So we'll go through this last 15/0 that's sitting at the bottom, and we'll pull. And then we'll sew through the same ZoliDuo bead that our thread was exiting. So we'll go back through the bottom hole of the ZoliDuo, and then we'll sew through that pyramid bead as well. We'll sew through the next two ZoliDuo beads. And then we'll sew through the pyramid bead that follows it. And here we'll sew through just one ZoliDuo bead. We're sewing through the bottom hole of the next ZoliDuo bead. Again, we'll pick up 3 15/0 seed beads. We're going to step up and come through the second hole of that ZoliDuo bead. We'll pick up a 15/0, a 2x3mm rondell, and another 15/0, and then we're going to skip over the pyramid bead, sew through the second hole of the next ZoliDuo. Here we want to pick up 2 15/0 seed beads, and we're going to sew back down through this bottom 15/0 seed bead that's sitting in between these two ZoliDuos. So the bottom 15/0, we'll sew back down through that, and that will allow for our 15/0s to create a V shape in between those two ZoliDuos. We're going to sew back through the bottom hole of the last ZoliDuo we exited. We'll sew through the next pyramid bead. We'll sew through the next two ZoliDuo beads. And then we'll sew through the next pyramid bead. Now we'll sew through one more ZoliDuo bead, just one. And our thread is now exiting in between these two ZoliDuo beads. Now we already have a set of 15/0 seed beads that's already lying in between these two ZoliDuo beads. We want to come up through just the bottom 15/0. We'll pick up 2 15/0 seed beads, and we're going to sew through the top hole of the ZoliDuo bead that we last exited. Here we'll pick up a 15/0, a 2x3mm rondell, and a 15/0. And we'll sew through, we'll skip over the pyramid bead and sew through this next ZoliDuo bead, the second hole of the next ZoliDuo bead. We want to pick up 2 15/0 seed beads, and we're going to sew back down through the last 15 that's sitting at the bottom in between these two ZoliDuo beads. We'll go through the last 15. And now our component is pretty much done. What we want to do now is we'll sew back through the bottom hole of the ZoliDuo bead we last exited. We'll tie one knot here. And sew through this next pyramid bead. And we'll tie 2 knots here. I'm going to turn over to the back of the beadwork, and I will end my working thread. I'm going to just cut it and burn it down. Now what I want to do is end my tail thread. And I'm going to move it over just one bead away from the knot that it's sitting next to right now. So I'm going to, well actually I'll move it over a couple beads. I'll sew through the 15 and I'll sew through that pyramid bead that our tail thread was sitting next to. And here we'll tie a knot and end our tail thread. If I can and then I'll end that thread from the back of the beadwork. And now our component is complete. What we want to do is make enough components to finish our bracelet. So go ahead and continue making components in the bracelet design that I have right here, this one that I made. We have a total of 6 components, and this bracelet is approximately 7.5 inches. So if you would need to adjust the length to make it smaller, you can adjust the number of components that you use. Instead of 6, you more than likely use maybe 5 components, and you may have to extend the length of your class. Okay, so let's get our components made so that we can begin to join them together and finish off our bracelet. Okay, to add our class and to connect our components, we'll need approximately 2 yards of beading thread, and I added 1 needle on one end of the thread and the other needle on the other end of the thread. With 1 needle, we'll pick up 3 11/0 seed beads, and then we'll place our needles through our cup button. 1 needle will go through one hole, and the other needle will go through the other hole. And we want to bring those down and center them on our thread. On each needle, we'll pick up 3 11/0 seed beads. And we'll let those drop down. With one needle, I'll pick up 1 11/0 seed bead, and then with the other needle, we'll cross through in the opposite direction that same 11/0 seed bead. And we'll let those beads drop down. And this is what you'll have. With each needle, we'll pick up 2 15/0 seed beads and let those beads drop down. And now we're ready to connect our first component. So on the component where we have our 15/0 seed beads sitting in between our two ZoliDuos, we want to place one needle to the side for a moment. With our right needle, we're going to go through the top 15/0 seed bead on one side that's sitting right next to the ZoliDuo. So working with our right needle, we'll go through the top 15/0 on the right side. We'll go sew through that 15/0 and then sew through our ZoliDuo bead. Now we want to sew through the next 15/0 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle and the following 15/0. We'll sew through the next ZoliDuo bead, and then we'll sew through the top 15/0 following that. Here we'll pick up 3 15/0 seed beads. And we're going to come across to the other top 15/0 seed bead that's sitting right next to the ZoliDuo bead. So we're going to kind of jump this bridge, sew through that top 15/0, and then sew through our ZoliDuo bead. We'll sew through the next 15/0, 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle and 15/0. And we'll place our right needle to the side for a moment. We'll pick up our left needle and we'll do basically the same thing. We're going to come through the top 15/0 on our component that's sitting right next to this ZoliDuo bead, where we're connecting our cup button. So we'll sew through that 15/0 that's at the top, and then we'll sew through our ZoliDuo bead. We're going to sew through the next 15/0, 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle, and the next 15/0 following it. We'll sew through that the next ZoliDuo bead, and then we'll sew through the top 15/0 that's sitting right next to the ZoliDuo bead. So the 15/0 that's at the top. We'll pick up 3 15/0 seed beads. And then we're going to sew through the other 15/0 that's at the top across this way, and it's sitting right next to our ZoliDuo bead. So we're going to kind of jump over this little area and sew through this top 15/0 and our ZoliDuo bead. And those 3 beads will form a small arch in between these two ZoliDuo beads. We'll sew through our 15-0, our 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle, and the next 15-0. Okay, and this is what you'll have. I'm going to put this left needle to the side for a moment. I'm going to, working with my right needle, we're going to get ready to add in our next component. And we'll go ahead and set up the beads on the mat so that I know that I'm picking them up in the correct order. So to connect these components, we're going to be using 15-0s, ZoliDuos, and 2 by 3 millimeter rondelles. Okay. All right, so our thread on our right side right now is exiting from this 15-0, 2 by 3, 15-0 combination. So it's coming out of that last 15-0. Here, we want to pick up one 15-0 seed bead. We're going to pick up the bottom hole of a right ZoliDuo bead. So our ZoliDuo beads are going to sit in between our components such that they will make a V like this. So we're going to pick up our right ZoliDuo bead first by going through that bottom hole. We'll pick up another 15-0 seed bead, and then we'll pick up our left ZoliDuo bead. We're going to pick up another 15-0 seed bead, and now we're ready to connect this to our second component. So we're going to connect the components again where the 15-0s are sitting in between the two ZoliDuo beads. We're going to connect this portion kind of on the opposite side of where we exited our first component. So we were exiting from this 15-0 that's right after the 2 by 3. We're actually going to come into the 15-0 that's sitting right next to the 2 by 3 rondelle. So we'll go in through this 15-0. We'll sew through the 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle, and then we'll sew through that next 15-0 seed bead. And your beads will sit like that. We'll pick up two 15-0 seed beads. We're going to come back through the top hole of this connecting ZoliDuo bead. We'll pick up a 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle. We'll sew through the top hole of the next connecting ZoliDuo bead. And then we're going to pick up two 15-0 seed beads. And we're going to come back through this set of beads right here, which is going to be our 15-0, our 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle, and our 15-0. We're going to come back through those on our first component. So sew through that 15-0, that 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle, and that 15-0, and pull. Okay, and this is what you'll have. Now we have a ZoliDuo bead that's right next to it. We'll sew through that ZoliDuo bead, and then there will be a 15-0 seed bead right next to it at the top. We're going to sew through that top 15-0 seed bead. Okay, I'm going to put this right needle to the side for a moment. We'll pick up our left needle, and we're going to pretty much do the same thing. I'm going to make sure I set up my beads in the order in which I need to pick them up. So on this side, we'll be going through a left bead first and then the right bead. Okay, so we'll pick up, our thread is exiting from this 15/0 seed bead right before ZoliDuo and right after our 2x3mm rondell. We want to pick up a 15/0 seed bead. We're going to go through the bottom hole of a left ZoliDuo. Pick up a 15/0 seed bead and go through the bottom hole of the right ZoliDuo. And your ZoliDuo should sit in between these two components so that it makes a sideways V. We'll pick up one more 15/0 seed bead, and then we're going to connect to our second component by coming through the 15/0, the rondell, and the 15/0 following it. So we'll go through those 3 beads. We'll pull. Here we want to pick up 2 15/0s, and then we're going to connect through the top hole of our connecting ZoliDuo. So the top hole. We'll pick up a 2x3mm rondell bead and go through the top hole of the next connecting ZoliDuo. Pick up 2 15/0 seed beads. And now we're going to come back through this 15/0, the 2x3mm rondell, and the 15/0 from the first component. I'm going to turn my bead work so I can get through these beads. Okay, on this side we'll go through this next ZoliDuo bead. And then we're going to sew through the 15/0 that's following it right at the top. So we'll go through the ZoliDuo bead and that 15/0 that's right at the top. Here we want to pick up one 15/0 seed bead. We'll pick up a 2x3mm rondell, and we'll pick up another 15/0 seed bead. And we're going to jump across to our second component. So the set of 15/0 seed beads that's in between these 2 ZoliDuo beads, I'm working with my left needle still. I'm going to sew through this top 15/0 and then the next ZoliDuo after it that's on the left side. So there's that top 15/0 and the ZoliDuo that follows it on the left side. I'm going to sew through that. And that will put our crystal and our 15/0 in the middle between those 2 components. With my left needle, I'll sew through this 15/0, this 2x3mm rondell, and the following 15/0. We'll sew through the next ZoliDuo bead. And then we'll sew through this top 15-0 that's following the ZoliDuo. So the top 15-0. I'm going to put my left needle down and I'm going to go back to my right needle. And here I want to pick up, I'm exiting from that top 15-0 from the first component, this top 15-0 that's in between these two ZoliDuo beads. I'm going to pick up a 15-0 seed bead. I'm going to sew through this 2x3mm rondell crystal that's already there. I'll pick up another 15-0, and then on our component we're connecting to, this second component, there's going to be a 15-0 seed bead that's at the top, sitting right next to this ZoliDuo bead on the right. We want to go through that 15-0 and then through that next ZoliDuo bead. And our components will be connected in the middle as such. So with this right needle, we're going to sew through this 15-0, this 2x3mm rondell, and the following 15-0. Sew through this next ZoliDuo bead and then sew through the 15-0 that follows it, the one that's at the top. Okay, here on this right side, we're going to pick up 3 15-0 seed beads. We're going to hop across this gap area and then we'll sew through the 15-0 that's at the top, sitting next to this ZoliDuo bead. Sew through that 15-0 and then sew through your ZoliDuo. We'll sew through the 15-0, the 2x3mm rondell, and the following 15-0. And then we'll put this needle to the side. With our left needle, we'll pick up 3 15-0 seed beads on this for this side. And we're going to hop across this small area, this small gap, and we're going to sew through the top 15-0 that's sitting right next to the ZoliDuo. We'll sew through that 15-0 and then through the ZoliDuo bead as well. In doing that, it forms an arch on that side, as same thing we did on this side. Okay, with our left needle, we're going to sew through our 15-0, our 2x3mm rondell, and our 15-0. If I can get my needle through, yeah, there we go. Okay, so we've added our second component on, and we are now in position to add on our next component. So I'll go through that one more time, and then we can continue adding our components until we get to the end. So here's my next component that I need to add. I'm already in position to do to sew on my connection, I'm just going to lay out the beads in the way they need to be connected so that I make sure I'm picking them up correctly. Okay. We want to pick up, so our thread is exiting, I'm working with my right needle. Our thread is exiting from that 15-0 that follows our 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle. I want to pick up a 15-0 seed bead. We're going to go through our right ZoliDuo on the bottom hole, pick up a 15-0, go through the bottom hole of the left ZoliDuo, and then pick up another 15-0 seed bead. We'll sew through the 15-0 to 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle and the 15-0 on the next component that we're adding. We'll pick up two 15-0 seed beads, come back through the next connecting ZoliDuo. Pick up a 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle, sew through the next connecting ZoliDuo, and we'll pick up two 15-0 seed beads, and we're going to come back through the 15-0 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle and 15-0 on this component that we started from. Now we'll move over to the center with this needle. We're going to sew through this next ZoliDuo bead, and then we'll sew through that 15-0 that's sitting at the top right next to it. I'm going to put this needle to the side. Okay, so with our left needle, and I turn my beadwork to the side, make it easier for me to get through these beads. I'm going to kind of arrange my beads in a way that I need to pick them up between these two components. Okay. I'm exiting from that 15-0 that's right after our 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle. We're going to pick up a 15-0 seed bead. We're going to go through the bottom hole of a left ZoliDuo bead, pick up a 15-0, go through the bottom hole of the next ZoliDuo bead, and then pick up another 15-0 seed bead. We'll let those beads drop down. Here we want to go through the 15-0, the 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle, and 15-0 on our component that we're connecting. It's kind of opposite the one we exited from our, I guess you can say, our originating component on this side. Okay. Now I want to pick up two 15-0 seed beads. I'm going to come back through the top hole of this ZoliDuo. I'll pick up a 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle, and I'll go through the second hole of the next ZoliDuo bead. I'm going to pick up two 15-0 seed beads, and then we'll come back through the 15-0 to 2 by 3 millimeter rondelle and the 15-0 on this component. Guess we can call that component A that we started from, and then the one we're going to component B. we'll sew through this next ZoliDuo bead, and then we'll sew through that top 15-0 that's following it. Okay, we'll pick up a 15-0 on each needle. We'll just do one needle. So I'm still working with my left needle. We'll pick up a 15-0 on that needle. We'll pick up our 2x3mm rondell and then our 15-0. Then we're going to go to our connecting component, the component we're connecting, component B, and we're going to sew through the 15-0 that's on the top next to the ZoliDuo on our left. Go through that 15-0 and then go through the ZoliDuo bead. With our right needle, we'll pick up a 15-0. We'll sew through that 2x3mm rondell. And we'll pick up another 15-0, and then we're going to sew through this 15-0 that's to the right, that's sitting right next to that ZoliDuo on our component B, the component we're connecting. And that will sit right in between the middle of our components. With my right needle, I'm going to sew through that 15-0, that 2x3mm rondell and that 15-0. We'll sew through this ZoliDuo bead and then sew through the top 15-0 that follows it. Here we'll pick up 3 15-0 seed beads. Gonna jump over this gap and go through the top 15-0 sitting next to the next ZoliDuo, and then we'll go through that ZoliDuo bead, and that will form our little arch. And then we'll sew through this 15-0, this 2x3mm rondell, and that 15-0. Putting the right needle to the side, I'm going to do same thing on this side. We'll sew through our 15-0, our 2x3, our 15-0. We'll come through this ZoliDuo bead, and then we'll go through the 15-0 that's sitting at the top that follows it. We'll pick up 3 15-0 seed beads, and then we're gonna go through this 15-0 that's right next to the ZoliDuo at the top. It'll form that little arch, and then we'll sew through our next 15-0, our 2x3mm rondell, and our 15-0. And now we have 3 components added, and we are in position to add the next component. So go ahead and continue to add the components as we have done until we've added all 6 of our components on. And once we've completed adding the last component, we'll come back and we'll show how to do the other end of the class and how we come back around and sew along the edge of the bracelet back down. We have our components joined together, and now what we want to do is to add our loop for our class. Right now, my thread is exiting from the last component that was added. So we added the last component, we came along the sides and added the 15-0 seed beads, and then we sew through the the next beads along the side of the component, so that we're exiting from these two 15-0s that are on the sides of the ZoliDuos at the top. So our thread is now exiting, our right thread is exiting from the right top top 15-0, and our left thread is exiting from that 15-0 on the left side. Here we want to pick up two 15-0 seed beads on each needle. And we'll let those drop down. With one needle, our right needle, will pick up one 11-0 seed bead. And then we'll cross through with the other needle through that same 11-0 in the opposite direction. And we'll pull those down, and this is what we'll have. I'm going to place one needle to the side, and now we want to add the beads for our loop. We'll pick up 26 11-0 seed beads. Alright, we'll let those beads drop down, and I'm going to just double check my count. Okay, so we have 26 11-0 seed beads. What we want to do is we're going to come back through this 11-0 that our threads cross through. We'll come back through that 11-0 seed bead. And that will form our loop. With the same needle, I'm going to come back down through these 15-0s, these two 15-0 seed beads that we added. Then we'll go through the 15-0 that's sitting at the top, right next to that ZoliDuo bead, and then we'll also go through the ZoliDuo bead. I'm going to put this needle to the side for a moment. With our left needle, I'm going to reinforce this loop by going through all those beads again. Make sure we don't skip any 11-0 seed beads as we're reinforcing this loop. So as we finish going through all those seed beads in the loop, we're going to come back through this 11-0 seed bead that our threads cross through. And then we're going to come back down through those two 15-0s. And then we'll go back through the 15-0 that's sitting at the top right next to the ZoliDuo on this side of the beadwork. So we'll go through the 15-0, and we'll also go through that ZoliDuo bead. So now we want to begin to go back down through the sides of our beadwork, working our way back to our cup button. So we'll sew through these beads on the side. We'll go through the, I'm working with, this will be the left needle. I'm just turning my beadwork to the side. We'll go through this 15-0, this crystal and this 15-0. Go through the ZoliDuo bead. We're going to sew through these 15-0 seed beads that are at the top of forming this arch. So that should be 5 seed beads. And we'll go through the next ZoliDuo bead. Here we're just going to come and go through the two 15-0s that were part of our connection for our components. We'll go through these two 15-0s. We'll go through this ZoliDuo bead. We'll go through this 2 by 3 millimeter rondell and go through the next ZoliDuo bead. We're going to go through these two 15-0 seed beads right next to our ZoliDuo that's we used in connecting the components. And now we should be back to the side of the previous component. We're just going to sew through this ZoliDuo on the previous component. We'll sew through these 5 15-0 seed beads that form this arch at the top right here. And then we'll sew through this next ZoliDuo bead. I'm going to lay this needle to the side. We'll working with our other needle. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to come along and sew through the beads on the side of the beadwork to reinforce the connections. So we'll go through this 15-0, this 2 by 3 millimeter rondell, and that 15-0. We'll sew through this next ZoliDuo bead. We're going to sew through these 5 15-0 seed beads that is forming this arch in between these two ZoliDuo beads, so the 5 15-0s at the top. And then we'll sew through this next ZoliDuo bead. We're going to sew through the two 15-0s that were used as part of our connection. We'll go through this ZoliDuo bead, this 2 by 3 millimeter rondell, and the next ZoliDuo bead. We'll come back through these two 15-0 seed beads that were used as a part of the connection between the components. And now we're just going to sew through the ZoliDuo bead that's part of the component. We'll sew through that ZoliDuo bead. We'll sew through these 5 15-0 seed beads. And then we'll sew through that next ZoliDuo bead. And now we're at the next connection. So here, again, we'll sew through the two 15-0s that's part of the connection. We'll come through this ZoliDuo bead, this 2 by 3 millimeter rondell, and this ZoliDuo bead. And then we'll sew through those two 15-0 seed beads. We're going to come through the next ZoliDuo bead on our next component. We'll go through those 15-0 seed beads and the next ZoliDuo bead, and then we'll sew through, we continue on and sew through the connections on the side for that's connecting our components together. We continue to do that along both sides of the bead work until we get to the end, and we'll exit out of these the last two ZoliDuos right before our clasp connection. So continue sewing through the beads along the edge as we have done until we get to the end. Once we complete sewing back down along the sides of our bracelet, our threads are now exiting from the ZoliDuos right before our clasp connection on both sides. Right now we want to reinforce our cup button. So with my right needle, I'm going to come up through these three 15-0 seed beads. If I can get through them. I'm going to cross through this 11-0. And then go up and around the 11-0s and the cup button. I'll go back through that 11-0 that we crossed through again, and then go down the 15-0s on this side of the beadwork. I'll place that needle to the side, and then we're going to go around the cup button with our other needle. So we'll go up through these 3 15-0 seed beads. Going to cross through that 11-0. And go up and around through the 11-0s in the cup button. Cross back through that 11-0. And then we'll come back down through these 15-0s on this side of the beadwork. Okay, so now our bracelet is done. What we want to do is sew through some beads and then end our thread and burn it down. So I'm just going to sew through a couple of the beads on this side and tie some knots as I go. I'm going to actually sew back down through the set of beads and end my thread somewhere along here. Okay, that's one side that we have completed. Now to end the thread on the other side. We'll do the same thing. We'll just go through some beads, tie a few different knots, and then we'll end the thread. And tying off my final knots. end the thread from the back of the beadwork. Okay, and our bracelet is now complete. So once again, this is our Zolina. This is the Zolina bracelet design. This is what it looks like if you put it on. Now, on my wrist, this one is a little bit big. This is a gorgeous color. It's a little bit big on me. I normally like to wear my bracelets a little bit more snug on my wrist. So if I were to do 6 components, I could actually do that if I were to use a slimmer clasp or clasp that brought the components closer together on the ends. So let me show the Jet AB one once again, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you enjoy this design. Thank you for watching.